Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I am your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today, I am here with longtime Jewish professional Adam Fox. Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
So you were just giving me the laundry list of which Jewish organizations you've worked for. Maybe we can, get into that as the podcast goes. Where I wanted to start is your last two projects that you've done have both been working in some way with people who aren't Jewish, helping to fight anti-Semitism, and they've both been very interesting. One was with former Congressman Joe Walsh. I actually talked to him on the podcast. You helped connect us, so thank you for that. And it was all about his attempt to, your guys' attempt to create an organization dispelling myths about Israel. And your second project that you were working on was working with former NFL players, trying to get them to reject anti-Semitism. I mean, what have you learned about, because it's easy to talk about anti-Semitism with Jews, I do it a lot, but what is that experience, talking and trying to fight anti-Semitism through talking with people who actually aren't Jewish?
Yeah, very good question. These are actually people that were already been really advocates for the Jewish community. They've been supportive of anything that I think the larger, greater American Jewish community holds dear when it comes to anti-Semitism, when it comes to equal rights, and when it comes to our support for a strong American-Israeli relationship. But I think the biggest thing that those taught me is that we have allies out there. And they can come either as big figures in social media, as former members of the Congress, and former athletes. And they want to have a voice. They want to be a part of this journey with the Jewish community when it comes to protecting ourselves, when it comes to fighting Jew hatred. And so it was an inspiration to see that there were so many non-Jewish people that want to be on our side. And the more we reach out to anybody, whether or not they are famous, they have the name recognition or not, for me, I can just go to a grocery store. I can go to anywhere. If I'm wearing my kippah, I get stopped all the time, and people say, we want to support you. How can we support you? So to me, it's like we got people out there. Let's go and engage with them because the more allies to the Jewish community, the better it is to fight anti-Semitism.
I sort of oscillate in my head about allyship. I know that's a buzzword, allyship. But whether or not I think Jewish allyship is something that is, there and always been there and, I can trust, or whether or not it's just, okay, this is raw, realpolitik pragmatics of, obviously the biggest example in my mind is, some of the people that have been most steadfast in support of the Jewish community in America over the last 2 years are evangelical Christians who, again, very pro-Israel. They send a lot of money to Israel. I'm very thankful for, them sending that. I always joke, that my cousin who spent time, in Gaza, he doesn't care if his lead vest is funded by, the synagogue or the church, it's still a lead vest. But, at the end of the day, I would say that's more, realpolitik pragmatic allyship, because of course, if you ask, the evangelical community what they eventually want to happen, it's, the rapture and Jesus comes and, we either get killed or converted. So I sort of oscillate back and forth whether or not I think, all allies are some version of that. I mean, again, I think also, another, sadly, way to view this is obviously Jews were allies of a lot of different progressive groups.
Mhm.
And, when it benefited everybody, they were, allies back to us. And then the second that it's no longer politically expedient for them, all of a sudden that allyship dissipates. But, I haven't actually worked with that many non-Jews on this. This is just sort of me sitting here from, inside the Jewish community. I'm reminded just, to add a little bit of Torah into the podcast, there's that famous portion of the Torah where Bilam, who's this, enigmatic non-Jewish prophet that is hired by a king to curse the Israelites. And he sort of gives this, laundry list of curses that end up turning into blessings. Readers can go read the entire story, but he has this one verse at the end, Am levaded yishkon, right? A nation that dwells alone. And this is
Mhm.
what he says about the Jewish people. And then, of course, we have 3,000 years of commentary debating back and forth whether or not that is a curse or a blessing. But I oftentimes think about this idea of like, what do you think? Is allyship really possible, or even you, when you're working with people who aren't Jewish that have been committed to this fight, is something in the back of your head saying like, okay, they're doing it now, but if X, Y, or Z happens, everything could change.
Sure. Great question. And for me, we'll start with the two examples you brought up. When I got connected to Joe Walsh shortly after October 7th, he was so just genuine about Jewish students and what they were going through. And when I started talking to him, it was very clear like his support just came from his heart. He just knew who was the side of righteousness and who was the side of causing harm to the Jewish community. He didn't come from any other alternative angle. Likewise, with the football players and athletes of Project Max, which is a phenomenal organization started by my friend Eric Rubin, which combats all anti-Semitism, racism, and intolerance through sports. All these ambassadors, they just genuinely are supportive of us. There was no, well, these are the, we have to make sure every Jew is in Israel, so Jesus can come again, and there's going to be a new rapture and all that. They just came from because from it was in their heart for the right thing to do. Now, with all my stops, whether it was the three Hillels that I worked for, Chabad, two JCCs, BYO, anybody who came to us in support and wanted to partner with us, collaborate with us, to interface stuff, I had so very little indication that these people were from that position of, well, this group we're going to seek to convert. We're going to,
No, I don't mean, sorry, I don't mean direct, ulterior motive, as in,
yeah.
someone's showing up to Hillel and saying, I love you guys, but meanwhile he's,
Oh,
passing out flyers. I mean, just in terms of like big picture, I guess, like almost getting into the philosophy of allyship, whether or
right.
not, you know, it is possible for Jews to like truly have an ally. Again, this is just sort of me pontificating off of
Yeah.
very little sleep here, but just thinking about this, right? Like, I'll give another example. I noticed, even when I was in college, and of course, whenever I make statements like this, I'm not talking about individuals. I'm just talking about general trends. I always have to, give that reminder. A lot of Indian students started coming to Hillel, and
Mhm.
that was directly at the time when India Pakistan was flaring up, and there was some again, among some people in India, obviously with the Prime Minister Modi, some very anti-Islamic sentiments. And so a lot of them were like, oh, who on campus, do generally the Muslim students not like? Oh, it's the Jews. Okay, let's go find the Jews. And,
Yeah.
all of a sudden, and this is a trend that I think was pretty national that, if you ask a lot of Hillels, what's your demographic? It's, oh, yeah, it's almost all Jews. Yeah. And then there's a couple of students from India that, for some reason always come. But like, even a story like that, right? It's like
Yeah.
over and over again, you have people that almost it's either useful at the time or it's the right political thing to do or anything like that. Like I don't know, I'm just because I think in my life I'll give the real reason for this question, and then you can see if you want to move on or answer it. Hillel at some point had invested a lot of money in trying to obtain non-Jewish allies, and I think some Hillels are still in that business. I don't know what your Hillel did, but I'll give a little bit of my experience. I ran multiple Israel trips over the last 8 years, taking non-Jewish student leaders to Israel, to all the complexity of Israel, not the birthright Disneyland version of Israel, but like really trying to figure out okay, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not simple, it's complex. Here are all the tension points. Here are I think the reasonable spectrum of disagreement that anyone could have. And we did that. We took students to DC for a number of different conferences, and post October 7th, virtually none of it worked, right? Like it was so clear that this attempt to, try to go into different, minority communities that in theory should have had similar sentimental experiences to the Jewish people, just the fact that the culture changed on campus and the culture changed within progressivism just overnight.
Mhm.
Nobody from, the LGBT club or nobody from, the Black Student Union just wanted anything to do with Jewish students,
Mhm.
despite the fact that many of the leaders, both present and past, had actually spent time, not just in Hillel, but in Israel. And like it was clear that they couldn't even believe the things that they were saying, you know?
Mhm.
And so I went through that experience, and not to, I don't want to, be the old grumpy person that was like, oh, none of it worked. But like, I'm just thinking of like from an opportunity cost perspective. I guess this is more of the question, right? Like, we only have X amount of time in a week, in a month, in a year, all of this. And thinking about opportunity costs, my first couple of years on campus, I invested so much time talking to non-Jews about Judaism, anti-Semitism in Israel, because for me, I was like, oh, well, I don't know, David, who went to, Jewish camp his entire life, like David knows, enough about, anti-Semitism in Israel, but like, I don't know, Scott, the non-Jewish student that's sitting there, if I if I can talk with Scott, I've just created an ally. And like now I almost have the exact opposite perspective. I look at, and of course, if a non-Jew wants to come to Hillel Shore, obviously I teach at UCI, so my class is full of non-Jews. That's sort of a different thing because that's more academic. I don't really have polemical, desires in my class past, students critically thinking. But I don't know. I just look at myself and I've in some way given up on this, but you haven't. And I think that's really interesting and helpful because I think we need people to not, Jews aren't enough people to have people giving up. So that's sort of more the question.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely we shouldn't be giving up, in my view. After the seventh, at Colorado State Hilla, we made still the same effort that we did before. In fact, probably a little bit more into trying to outreach to all different communities out there, whether it's the Black Student Union, whether it was Pride, whether it was even the Muslim Student Association and those part of Asian Pacific cultures. And some were good responses. Some were, I think they were very concerned with the situation going on. But nonetheless, once you reach one person, once you get through to just that, then you've accomplished a great deal, right? Just changing and not even changing, just finding one more ally out there or helping to one more person learn more about the Jewish community, about what Jewish students are going through, and enough about Israel. And they keep an open mind and they're willing to have a conversation and they're willing to start accepting some of our truths. We don't know where how beneficial that is to us, and I think that's the beautiful part of it, right? That one person can go back to their communities and start having discussions with them about their experience. So it's not necessarily so kind of to your point, right? It's when we don't see it, then we tend to think, oh, then it's not working. But when we just got to that one person, let's say you influenced that Scott person, or just helped him learn more about what it means to be Jewish, what is Judaism. We don't know what Scott's going to do when he goes home and talks to his family, when he talks to his friends, when he talks to his subgroups in his college campus. We may never see it, but it's creating these allies that in time, when we need them, they could come through for us. So it's, part of being Jewish, right, is about hope, right? That when something happens to us, we're going to find people who are going to be with us. And that alone, that thought alone, that we can just have that ripple effect, will always be a motivator for me to, and I think for any Jewish professional to really try to connect with as many non-Jews as possible to share what it's like to be Jewish and what that means.
No, I really love that. I love your idealism, even if I try to muddy
Yeah.
it a little bit. So I apologize for that. You've been working with former professional athletes, a lot of NFL players, specifically talking about this mission. I mean, what is that like? I feel like that's a very interesting, because professional athletes have such a spotlight on them in society today. We don't often think of them as sort of like thought leaders, although that is obviously changing with, one of them, I think one of the big interesting switches is it was that famous Michael Jordan interview in the 90s, right? Where I'm completely forgetting the context, but they asked Michael Jordan, why he's not advocating. I think it was during the LA riots, maybe, but I might be completely butchering this. Someone can
Yeah.
fact check me on this, but a reporter asked him, hey, why are you not standing up for, I don't know, the black community or whatever. And his answer, he looked in the camera and he said, because Republicans buy sneakers too. And it sort of went down as this sort of like famous moment of professional athletes saying like, why would
Yeah.
I want to piss off half the country, if you're trying to, but that is very much shifted, I think, in a way. And, you've seen now athletes, both on the right and the left, that are not afraid to sort of wear their politics on their sleeve. That's
Mhm.
probably just because of the age of social media and everybody sort of having to make statements about everything. But what have been some of the most interesting things that you've learned working with athletes and former athletes on this?
Yeah. So this goes back to an amazing organization, Project Max. I encourage everybody to look into it. I'll share kind of the biggest thing that I learned from it, being part of it, is through Project Max. There's another organization, Athletes for Israel, and a few months ago we sent two NFL. Both are in the Kansas City Chiefs Hall of Fame. They made it to the all pro, they were all pros. Nick Lowry and Tony Richardson. And so they went to Israel, and they got the trip there. They met top Israeli leaders, including the president Isaac Herzog. They met other elected officials, Speaker of the Knesset. They toured throughout Israel, and they saw Jewish communities, especially those impacted by October 7th at the kibbutz, families of hostages. But they also went to, the Jews villages that were hit by Hezbollah. That like the big one that unfortunately we lost 12 Israeli Jews children. And so they went through this whole experience, and for them to go into it and not really, they don't know what to expect, right? They're going to this country, and at the time that was severely impacted, and still there's this ongoing conflict with Israel's defense against Hamas terrorism.
Was that a hard ask, by the way? Because obviously, I've been to Israel twice since October 7th, and but I was in Israel during the Second Intifada, and I was in Israel during the 2020, 2014 war. So I sort of know when, obviously, just for listeners that have never been to Israel, even
Mhm,
though Israel's tiny, right? There's about 20 Israels that fit into California.
mhm.
Most of the wars are sort of at, very acute fronts, and then the rest of the country is oddly extremely normal, right?
Yeah,
So, the
yeah.
only thing I noticed, I was there in December, right? So this is 2 months after October 7th. And,
Mhm,
obviously you could notice it because there were, posters of the hostages everywhere. And there was obviously a lot more soldiers walking around the street than normal. And a lot
mhm.
of the shops were closed because, of course, most of the normal employees were called into reserves. But aside from that, walking through the streets 99% of the time, you like didn't actually notice,
Mhm.
you would not think, oh my God, this is a country that's, in an acute war. But if I only watched the news and that was all I knew about Israel, I would think that like every neighborhood in Israel is like an active war zone. So like, what was that conversation like
Yeah.
trying to convince these people that had never been there? Like, hey, you want to come to Israel, 2 months into, or whatever, 5 months into this war?
Yeah, well, there really wasn't much convincing to it. They wanted to go. They wanted, they're ambassadors to Project Max, and they wanted this experience to see what Israel was like, especially during the time of conflict. So, I think maybe some other people would take a little bit more time convincing because they don't know, based on what the media, social media especially, is trying to show like all of Israel is at imminent risk all the time. But I think even people that follow enough to know that most of Israel is safe. A lot of, again, when we have the allies, they want to get the full picture. So going to Israel, they got the full picture of really what Israeli society is, right? Walking the streets of Tel Aviv and Haifa and just doing things that you could, on one hand, be doing here in America, right? With all the shops and all the restaurants and all the entertainment, the museums. And then you have what makes Israel really amazing, right? Which is everybody's equal there, right? You can be Jewish, you can be part of the Israeli Arab Society, Muslim, Druze, and you're just as protected. You just have all the same equal rights. You can be business leaders, you can be in government, you serve in the military if you want. You can be doctors, lawyers, anything. So especially when they visited the Jewish community, they saw how amazing that the Israeli Jews are proud to be Israeli. And so I think when they go into this, going to Israel, they want to see the full picture. And then when they get a picture again, but they don't know what that full picture is. So when they go there and they get it and they come back and they're like, oh my goodness, like this is a true place that anybody can go to. Like if anybody can literally live in Israel and be free, exercise the same rights, practice their faith freely. And so a big takeaway coming back was, just the amazement of how, a century ago, right, what the land was like and what it is now, right? A free democratic country, Jewish majority and an equal non-Jewish minority. And that's the message to be spread about Israel, which dispels, of course, a lot of myths and lies about what Israel is, right? It's not an apartheid state, right? There's no segregation of Israeli Arabs. They get the same equal rights. And when there is a discrimination case, Israeli law takes care of those that are attempting to discriminate. So
Was there
when
any focus on, the attention points within that? Because obviously, and this is something that I think is also very interesting in thinking about how to present Israel
mm,
outwardly, both to, again, in our conversation, around non-Jewish allies, but even to Jewish students that say are going to Israel for the first time.
mm,
There is a version of Israel, and maybe this is me pushing back a little bit. There is a version of Israel that is exactly what you just laid out. That is true. There's also another version of Israel that just like you can do to every country. So I think that's the important disclaimer.
mm,
Focus on all of the hardest tension points within that society,
Mhm.
surrounding, law and, especially treatment of Arabs and things like that. And this would be a trip that would obviously focus much more on the West Bank and focus on checkpoints. And again, I'm the first one to, obviously always say, there's good historic precedent. It's not that one day Israel woke up and said, hey, it'd be a lot better if we had three checkpoints between Bethlehem and, Nablus. But, obviously there's historic precedent for this, but that's going to be a very different trip and give people a very different color than, you walk through Jaffa and Haifa, which, just for listeners, these are two examples of cities that have, Jews and Arabs living side by side, and they're all full democratic citizens of Israel. And so, it's going to be a very different picture than if you cross the Green Line and go into the West Bank and, you just can understand, even though, and this is sort of like what I always say, I can totally understand and I even defend the need for checkpoints and the need for the security barrier or the wall and all, just for listeners' context, most of these things were post Second Intifada as suicide bombers and terrorists were crossing the Green Line in mass. So, like, these things are important security wise. It also, I could totally understand why, if I was a 20-year-old Palestinian who every single day to get to work or to visit my family or to even like go on a hike in the, hillside of the West Bank, I had to cross, three checkpoints that could all of a sudden, could take anywhere between 20 minutes and 3 hours,
Mhm.
so was there any focus on that? Because I often sort of oscillate also when talking to, people about Israel. Which version do you give them? Because I'm very much into, obviously intellectual honesty. On the other hand, you know, almost never when you first meet somebody for the first time do you give them like, everything, right? You're not going to spill
Yeah.
all of your dirtiest laundry, on a first date. So, you
Yeah.
know,
Well, I guess the best way to answer this, right? And you alluded to because I have had all that experience with Hillel and birth and getting students to go on birthright. A lot of them are aware of the issues that I think surround Israel and the Palestinian territories, about the checkpoints, about the freedom of movement Palestinians have when it comes to trying to work in Israel or just trying to go from one village to another. Um, it is important to have those conversations. And there's, as you said, there's the context of why checkpoints exist, why there's a need for extra security in that area. It's good to get the full picture. It absolutely is. But when you provide the context, and as you said, after the Second Intifada, it's the necessity because at any point the violence could spill over easily into Israeli territory, into the state. Um, what I think it overall does is it empowers, I think, students or adults, after college or not after college, they're just adults to ask questions. And what's great about Israel is that as a democratic state, all opinions are welcomed. If you go to Israel and you become critical of, and even while you're there, you're critical of maybe this because maybe you lean more left and progressive, and you don't think that the checkpoints are good and it infringes, you can have those conversations. You can have them with those that support the checkpoints and support the need for extra security. Uh, and I think when anybody, whether it's Jewish students going on to Israel, whether it's the athletes going to Israel, when they see those conversations actually being had, right, it makes them see, hey, this is again just like America, right? You can have different viewpoints and have these discussions, and we're not necessarily there to provide and to give them the absolute truth that they should know, right? We can give our perspective on it, right? Your perspective, my perspective, but just for them to go and experience it firsthand, or just to learn more about the subject, which I think Israel in general does talk about, Israelis talk about, Jewish Americans and the diaspora Jews talk about. They in turn are going to develop their own opinions. And the idea, right, is that, hey, we can have them. We can still be supportive of a Jewish community. We can still be supportive of Israel, but we can have our own opinions about what we think better strengthens Israeli democracy. So I think that's the best way to go about that when you're having those conversations.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's one of the things that I think, there's been endless talk in the American Jewish community about the way that we talk about Israel, not so much in Hillel. I've always thought this is a cop out of, students that are 21 or 22 saying like Jewish organizations never talk critically about Israel, because that's sort of like all Jewish leaders in America
Yeah.
talk about is sort of these tension points around Israel. But I
Mhm.
I could imagine it's true for, summer camps and youth programs for middle schoolers and high schoolers and never actually getting into a lot of, again, I don't even want to say criticism. Like I think of it more as tension points, right? Like there is a tension within Israel of freedom versus security, right? This is a basic tension that I think exists in all democracies, right? The example that I always give is, assuming you trust the government, which is a big assumption, but, assuming you trust that, let's say, the American government has your best interest and your safety in mind, if the government tapped everybody's phone, our relative security would go up because if somebody was planning to do something terrible, the government would be able to sniff it out sooner. But your relative freedom would go a little bit down because you'd have, some guy or probably some AI system, listening to you every second, trying to, figure out exactly what you're doing. So there's a tension there. In Israel, the tension is actually even more difficult of a tension because oftentimes the population, right, aka the Palestinians in the West Bank, that are the ones that are suffering this quote unquote, relative loss of freedom, they're not the ones benefiting from the increase in security. So it just creates this, this tension. Again, this doesn't mean, Israel bad, all the things that I think a lot of people, might conclude hearing that, but like really difficult life situations of trying to balance these different values and different historic precedents. It's interesting because on the one hand, we don't focus that much on a lot of these things. On the other hand, when I'm on campus and when you listen to some of the, lies that are being spread about Israel, the other side makes it seem like this is the most black and white issue in human history. It's like, there was the Nazis and they were obviously the bad guys, and then, the next most obvious thing in history is, Israel bad. And so, I think just tactically when teaching about this, and especially with non-Jews, I think there is an interesting debate to be had of like, do you go, no, this is really complicated. You actually have to spend months and go visit, and, maybe then you'll have a tiny understanding of this conflict. Or do you just say, no, 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 it's actually very simple. We're the good guys, you're the bad guys.
Mhm. Yeah. Look, the greater conversations with people is to show, and I think with any country, right? And that's the big thing we always emphasize is what works well for Israelis and for what support for Israel looks like, and what better ways we can do to strengthen Israeli democracy. Um, in terms of being like critical of Israel, right? There's that notion is yes, you can criticize Israeli policies, you can criticize Israeli politicians, but we continue to emphasize that that doesn't mean that we're delegitimizing Israel, that we're calling for its destruction, like some other folks that can't make that distinction. So for me, education, conversations is the best path moving forward. Again, it kind of goes back to what we earlier talked about, which is having uh, the ripple effect, right? When you bring this whole perspective to somebody, when having conversation about them, even giving your own personal viewpoint, uh, and you're creating an ally, we don't know where that person's going to go with it, right? They could connect with all these different people and have these conversations with them, and then give their own viewpoints. So, again, I think everything is a ripple effect, and we just do the best that we can to have conversations of what we know about all parts of Israeli society, right? Because it isn't just this issue alone, right? There's issues between secular and ultra-Orthodox Judaism that really is a big tension in Israeli society. And in some ways, many can argue a lot of the positions that some of the ultra-Orthodox takes may undermine and may harm Israeli security and the democratic process and the rule of law. So, and maybe it's certain government policies may be harming the rule of law and justice. So, yeah, just continue having the conversations. And I think we create people that say, hey, Israel's just like any other country, right? There's things that are great about it, and there's things that we hope to see Israeli improve on it, whatever their opinion on that is.
So you worked for both Hillel and Chabad. You're probably one of the few people that I know that have worked for both organizations. I've talked a lot about, Hillel and Chabad on the podcast. There is a general trend of a lot of not just campuses. I think this is also true for synagogue life of Chabad sort of coming in and just, winning in some, very real sense. And again, not that it's a, competition, or not that it's a, it's not a zero sum game of, who's going to put each other out of business, but like Chabad and, the liberal Jewish community, the pluralistic Jewish community just have like different visions, obviously different views of what it means to live sort of quote unquote like a good Jewish life. Also very different, tactics when it comes to, outreach and everything like that. Why do you think, and if you reject the premise of this question, I would also like to hear, but like why in a general sense do you think Chabad is winning in not just a lot of campuses, but also a lot of, suburban neighborhoods that for the last 100 years were sort of dominated by, a Reform synagogue. And all of a sudden Chabad has come, and taken 70% of the members. Like, why is Chabad winning?
Sure. It's hard to frame it as who's winning and who's losing, right? Chabad is a phenomenal place where Jews of all backgrounds can go to and have a Jewish home, whether it's services, whether it's just needing counsel from the rabbi, whether it's community events and holidays, which in a way is what synagogues provide. And then for Jewish students, when it's Chabad on campuses, for Jewish students to go and celebrate Shabbat and to do all the things that bring Jewish student communities together. I don't frame it as winning, and I think one of the issues that within the Jewish community that we have to start getting over is when we try to create the winner versus loser mentality, when we try to play the numbers game. Oh, this people has more. They're trying to take away people from this community, Jewish community, to another. Then we start picking battles that are just unnecessary. Um, Chabad seeks Jewish unity. And so there's people, whether or not they are Chabad on campuses, like students, or whether it's out in the communities, which Chabads are throughout many cities, big and small. Um, Members are often, and they don't really call it members. So I'll just say Jews are part of both. There's a few that I think exclusively choose one, but there's so many others that just they love Jewish communities in general, right? Big plural, just their Jewish community in their city, right? So whether it's doing stuff with Chabad, whether it's going to other synagogues that they do or other events with the greater Jewish community, the everyday person doesn't want to see competition. And when we start having competitions, then we force people to really pick and choose. Then we see more people going on the exclusive route. And then, then we create the notion of winner versus losers. And then at the last part of that is that when it comes to, when there's a case law of October 7th, when there's a case like when Israel has the right to defend itself, when there's a case where anti-Semitism is skyrocketing from college campuses to the medical field to the education, then we don't have a unified response that shows how really resilient and the ruach that we have to say, no, this is harming all of us, and here's our unified response to it.
I appreciate that. I don't know if I fully agree with it. I agree with framing it as a competition, terrible idea, right? So I think, on campus or in the synagogue world, I think this is also, interestingly, Chabad's been on campus
Mhm.
for, a long time, but I think, it might have been, the last 15 or 20 years, new
Yeah,
Chabad synagogues are popping up, really just all over the world. Okay, it's one thing to have a Chabad synagogue pop up in an area that doesn't have any Jewish life, and that's, incredible. I mean, it's also incredible when they open up in a suburban area that has a couple other synagogues, but like at some point, when historians are going to talk about the 21st century of American Judaism, I'm teaching a class right now on American Jewish history. So it wasn't a competition. Nobody in the 1920s or 30s would have ever said that, say, the JCC movement, founded by Mordechai Kaplan, just so we can
Mhm.
get into the weeds of American Jewish history, nobody would have ever thought of the JCC competing with conservative synagogues, right? It's just like, what does the JCC have to do with conservative synagogues?
Yeah,
Yet, at the end of the day, we all have limited money, right? So if you're going to be a member somewhere,
Mhm.
are you a member of the JCC or a member of a shul? We all have limited leisure time. So if your
Yeah,
kids are going to go to an after school program, are they going to go through the synagogue or at the JCC? If you want to plan a barbecue for your community, are you going to do that through your synagogue or the JCC? And so, in the 1920s and 30s, there was this move that we can now locate in America of Jewish life moving from, socialism, not socialism politically, but sociability around the synagogue to what Mordechai Kaplan deemed the JCC, which he actually, the tagline of the JCC was a shul with a pool, right? So a synagogue that also has, that was sort of his vision. So yes, if you popped into 1925 New York and you were telling, and you asked someone this question on a podcast, they would have probably given your answer. But like historically, we can see that there was, again, not a competition in the way that like you open a business and I'm like, I'm going to open that same business down the street, but like different, again, at the end of the day, you know, not that I ever think making things a numbers game is good. Judaism actually has a long tradition of not counting people, I think, for this exact reason. But at the end of the day, organizations need philanthropic dollars to come in to survive. And the way to get philanthropic dollars is to show that you are succeeding in some, and the best way to show success is on some very real, quantitative, data sense. And so in that way, there is, if a reform congregation all of a sudden loses 50% of their members over the course of 10 years and then you find them all in Chabad, like it's not a competition, but like I do think it's worthwhile from the liberal Jewish leaders asking, hey, what changed? Because I think implicit within a lot of this is most Jews that go to Chabad don't agree with the Chabad philosophy and theology, right? Otherwise, they would be Chabad, right? And so, I do think it's worth asking, and this isn't in a derogatory sense, right? I think that there is this, I've said this a lot on the podcast, especially within Hillel, made up of mostly Jews from a non-Orthodox background, there's this almost like disgust when they ask the question, right? I don't think that's too harsh of a word of like, why do people go to Chabad with the implication, the implication of like, this is terrible and backwards and whatever. For me, I grew up Orthodox, so Chabad is a lot closer to the Judaism that I practiced growing up than Hillel is. So I totally get it, and I totally get some of the appeal. But I'm wondering, there haven't been a lot of people that have actually worked for both. So I'm curious, I mean, what were you doing there, or were you doing the exact same things for both? I'm sort of asking, if you could peel back the curtain and think like, you've worked for so many different Jewish organizations, like why do you think Chabad, because again, if you were to go back 70, let's say 80 years ago, right, to the pre-Holocaust era, right, before everything in the Jewish world changed, and you were to say that Chabad, which at that time was, just as you know, just as vague of a Hasidic movement as, Breslov, or it was smaller than Satmar. I mean, still to this day, the fun fact is Satmar is the largest Hasidic sect in the world. So it's not even Chabad, right? I think, there's some statistic, what is it, like 3 or 4% of all Jews are from Satmar, right? And Chabad, I think it's only, 1% of Jews are Chabad, yet like probably most of the people listening to the podcast are trying to Google what is Satmar right now. Right. So like nobody could have guessed this. And I think this speaks to the genius of, the last Rebbe of Chabad, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, but that's, maybe I'll do a separate podcast on him one time. But like, if you're thinking about this question, like why, what would you have told that person in the 1930s or 40s as to why Chabad would be the successful organization that it is today?
Well, the reason why they're successful is because they are really committed to outreach. They're really committed to seeing a Jew for a Jew, and want to be there for them. And they don't pressure them to adopt ultra Orthodox lifestyles. They don't force anybody to say you have to believe this, even though that's what they firmly say. Look, yeah, there's things about Chabad and the philosophy in general of ultra Orthodox Judaism. It's kind of hard to put them in that label because when you say ultra Orthodox, you think of those Satmars and those that actually like oppose the modern political state of Israel, which Chabad is very supportive of the political state of Israel. But we can, I have my own disagreements with them, right? Who is a Jew, right? I don't necessarily believe, and I don't believe, for example, that we have to still go by the mother, right? If somebody was raised in a household where there was a Jewish father, non-Jewish mother, and they raised that child to be Jewish, I don't think there's any other thing that person has to do to be Jewish, right? They're already Jewish. So there's things that I disagree with, and I think there's a lot of people who go to Chabad that kind of maybe share that view, and some others, right? They don't do Shomer Shabbos, right? They drive to Chabad for Friday night dinners or to events that otherwise Shomer. They don't have a full kosher lifestyle. The Chabad rabbis and rebbitzins are aware of that. But they just become just an open and welcoming place. I don't think, and this is just my view, both of working for a Chabad campus, which is that I did at NEU, Rabbi Dovi Shapiro, a great person, or the Hillels that I worked for, which we collaborate with Chabad, is that in general, they're not trying to take students away. There's always collaboration, and as long as there's willing partners on all sides, and this wasn't just between Hillel and Chabad, this was within the greater Jewish community, the Reform synagogues, the conservatives synagogues, in some cases the Orthodox synagogues, so those some places I went to didn't have much of that other than Chabad, is that there's always a willingness to talk, have dialogue, to do things together. And again, it gets people to think that we don't have to exclusively go to Chabad. Now, you mentioned about the money part is Yeah, like Chabad, you don't have to be you're not like a paid member, right? So there's no annual fee. Of course, they do as an organization that needs money. Each Chabad, local Chabad has to raise money, and synagogues because of membership fees, they don't maybe have to do as much fundraisers, even though that they do. I think it's almost like an entirely not related issue because I think a younger generation of people don't want to pay to be part of a Jewish community, which is something that the synagogues used to rely on for decades, which I guess might be why you could say like decades and decades ago, why people were willing to pay back then to be part of a synagogue, but now they're not, right? Because especially you can get services on online, right? You can go to YouTube and be part of any synagogue virtually, and they may never know you, right? You're just following their Friday night service and
Although
just
I will say
you know,
anybody doing that, and I'm sure some of the listeners, to this podcast do that occasionally, I would strongly push you to try to not make that your totality of Jewish
yeah,
experience because I
yeah,
think, even just inherent to the name, right? Like, we don't call synagogue, it's actually, we don't call synagogues, holy worship places. We call synagogues Beit Knesset, which literally just means gathering places in
yeah,
Judaism, right? It's as if like, the gathering and hanging out and even, talking outside during services is more important than the actual prayer itself. That's not necessarily true, but I think that there is a strong case to make for that being true. I know we have about 10 minutes left. So, two things that you said that I wanted to, hop on. We could see which rabbit hole we want to go down. One, just on the Chabad piece before I forget, there was a lot of, this is just another, interesting historic anecdote. There was a lot of attempt to block Chabad in the 1960s and 70s from the wider pluralistic Jewish community. And so, the picture that we have now of 2025 of, there's this great working together. It wasn't for lack of trying by specifically, let's say, the reform movement for trying to actually push Chabad out of the mainstream. There was a really interesting historic debate. I think one of the more interesting, American Jewish debates that happened in the last 50 years was in 1974. The Rebbe wanted to do a public menorah lighting right outside of the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, which, now it seems, commonplace, of course. Chabad does, these lightings, every year in every city. But at that time, it was sort of the first time in Jewish history in
mhm,
America that Jews were going to do this public menorah lighting. And
mhm,
the other thing that's important and, that listeners have to know is that for about 100 years, Jews in America had been very fervent on the separation of church and state side of politics, right? So there were all these major court cases and Supreme Court cases in the 1900s about, separating church and state. And, obviously the church wanted to put up, say crosses on military, memorials and all these things. And the Jewish community was saying, hey, we can't do this. Religion should not exist in the public sphere in America. We are, capital L liberals, separate church and state. The Rebbe said, why bother, right? Like, it's obvious that, and he actually wrote this in an essay. He said, it's obvious to anybody that America is a Christian country, right? Maybe not a theocracy, but like, there are crosses and parks and things like that.
mhm.
Christmas is a national holiday, right? So like Jews should also bring our stuff to the, forefront. And now obviously, most Reform synagogues are also doing public menorah lightings. But that was, a very interesting debate. The other thing that I wanted to harp on, and then you can choose which one to respond, this conversation about Jewish identity. I think is very interesting and I think is a bigger deal than, because oftentimes when people talk about these tensions, that's always, offered as, oh, and there's also like this one issue of, patrilineal versus matrilineal. This is totally anecdotal, but I'm going to guess 30 to 40% of Jews that I meet today between, synagogue life and Hillel and everything else would not be considered halachic Jews according to, an Orthodox perspective. And again, I don't think this is anyone's fault necessarily. I think fault is sort of the wrong word. Again, I think of it as a tension point, right? The same thing, security, freedom, right? Like, I think there are solid arguments on both sides. And I think, you can really understand where each side is coming from. But this is, it used to be, let's say 10 years ago or 11 years ago when I was in undergrad and I was, invested in the Jewish community, maybe it would be one out of every five students. And now it's, one out of every four, one out of every three students, because obviously as, generations go on, the rates of intermarriage go up and also, Judaism acquires, more people who convert to Judaism, but through non-Orthodox denominations. And like, right, it's beautiful. And also it creates more of these, you know, people who are Jewish according to these groups and not Jewish according to these groups. And so it is a big tension. I don't know if you want to weigh in on that, but I thought I'd just spell that out.
Yeah, look, within the American Jewish community, and it's hard to speak for the more diaspora, in other countries because they probably have different level, I guess, different layers of importance in their discussions. But yeah, we for decades have had this core question: who is a Jew? Who can be Jewish? What does it mean to be Jewish? And how do we see the one Jewish community as that, as just one? Um, and so the toughest part that we have, right, is when we break ourselves into denominations, right? American Judaism, we have Reform, Conservative Orthodox, the traditional big three. Although we know there's more now, Reconstructionist renewal. We know Orthodox is modern Orthodox or ultra Orthodox. So it's more complex than just the basic three. But yeah, having, when we had those discussions about, for example, mother versus father, about which conversions are being accepted, and by what would that mean if they tried moving to Israel? There's always uh, that uniqueness, and I call it unique, about American Jewish life, is that we're continually having those discussions. And through the decades of debate, I don't know if debate's the right word, but yeah, we're having some debates over it. It hasn't entirely tore us apart, which is rather interesting, right? Especially those that convert through reform or were raised by a father that was Jewish and is part of a movement, and they might find themselves at a Chabad house or just at synagogue that maybe have a little more conservative view on it. But they still feel like they're Jewish. They still feel like they're welcomed, even though they're being sometimes told that, hey, you have to go through a different process in order to be considered Jewish,
Yeah,
according to
well,
our
what
yeah.
people who aren't halachically Jewish have to understand, and you have to understand this intellectually. If I know it's hard to understand it emotionally, but I'll just speak directly to them for a second. It's not because of any type of animosity, right?
Mm,
Like the same way that somebody who you know keeps kosher doesn't look at I don't know, cheese that didn't go under, the proper, oversight by rabbinic authority. There's nothing wrong with the cheese. It's just, oh, I prefer not to eat this, or
yeah.
it's just the same. It's a legal, religious view that just again, because so often people feel like they're identity is being rejected, and in some sense it is, which is why I think it's such a complicated issue, because one side is viewing this as like a cut and dry legal matter, and the other side is viewing this more of a identity, subjective, how do I feel matter. And I think they're both valid. I think it speaks to, I've been saying this for a while. I think I even mentioned this on my last podcast that I just had. I think there are just two different definitions of Judaism that are operative in the 20th and 21st century. I think there's halachic Judaism, and then there is peoplehood Judaism. And I don't think these are the same thing. I think there's obviously a ton of overlap. I think to be Jewish, you need to have at least one of these two elements, right? So, obviously a lot of people have both, but I think you need at least one of the two. In other words, you either
Yeah.
need to be halachically Jewish. If you're halachically Jewish, then it doesn't make a difference if you're involved in Jewish peoplehood, right? So if you're, let's just take an easy scenario, right? Both your parents are Jewish, right? It doesn't make a difference if you become an atheist, if you become a Christian, if you become an anti-Zionist, like whatever you do, you're still Jewish because halachically you're Jewish. On the flip side, let's say you're not halachically Jewish, but let's say you're part of the Jewish people. In other words, you have some ethnic tie to Judaism, right? Say your dad is Jewish, your mom is not Jewish, but you're very invested in Jewish peoplehood, right? You're involved in Jewish organization, you're doing all these things, right? Then you're Jewish. If that second person, say patrilineal, but is not involved in Jewish community, and is let's say is an atheist or converts to Christianity, or becomes an anti-Zionist, then I'm going to look at that person and be like, if somebody's a patrilineal Jew and anti-Zionist, I'm going to look at them and I'm going to be like, I don't really understand what is the operating Jewishness of your identity, right? You're not halachically Jewish. You're not Jewish in a way that over the last 1800 years people would have recognized as Jews. And second, you're also, not part of this, new conception of the Jewish people because you're actively working against the Jewish people. So, I do distinguish there. I know we've been talking for a while. I know, you have to run in a second. Is there any, you can either focus on this or just big picture, last thoughts, Adam?
Yeah. I'll do the big picture one. Um,
you don't want to touch it. You're like, I'm not going to
Yeah,
touch that, question
yeah,
of Jewish
yeah.
identity.
Well,
No,
look,
go for it.
I think a lot we said did make, some sense. I think that there's people that, in terms of peoplehood versus halakha Judaism, for me, at least my view is that I don't even make that separation. I just think everybody's who comes to accept Judaism and being Jewish, and obviously they don't believe in another religion, that they're Jewish. Big picture. For those of you who you'll probably see my hashtag when this comes out. I've undergone three emergency surgeries in the last month and a half. I nearly died on February 14th when my intestines got twisted. I was an hour away from not making it, and I spent several days in the hospital. At that time, I was collaborating with an amazing organization called End Jew Hatred, which everybody should go look at too, which unifies Jews and non-Jews, but especially just everybody coming together to fight End Jew hatred. I pulled off that event even through that surgery. I had two more surgeries since then. Both had to be rushed to the ER. Both were major complications, and I'm on the road to recovery. I started for a moment questioning, myself, like why did this happen to me, and uh, why me? Did I do something wrong as a Jew? Did I do anything? And what I really realized, and this kind of parts into a lot of what our discussion was about, is that anybody who finds themselves to be Jewish came to support me. It didn't matter if they were secular, if they were religious, if they were a Jew of color, if they were a Jew of a different, if they were LGBT Jew, if they were Mizrahi, Sephardi. I had Jewish friends all over the world of any part reach out to me and show their support. And so I think the reason why I somewhat disagree with that distinction, I don't know if disagree is the right word, is because I just saw how beautiful the Jewish community came together when we needed it the most. And that is why moving forward, no matter what I do, especially my recovery, that's what I want to preach is that we have an amazing Jewish community. And rather than trying to find ways to divide it and make distinctions, let's continue to push forward and see what we can do to make us as one as possible. Of course, there's going to be those issues that still exist. We're going to continue having discussions, but it never fully tore us apart. It never fully caused somebody to say, well, I don't feel comfortable. Maybe some people did, but in the greater picture, right, we're continuing to stay and survive. The way that I'm fighting for my life and the way that I did is the way that Jewish people have to fight for their rights, right? Especially if, for example, a Jew is being told by somebody else that they're not Jewish enough, they have to fight for that. They have to fight for their right to be part of our community. And I think, and then in general, all Jewish people have to fight for their rights to defend themselves in the onslaught of anti-Semitism, to defend the Jewish homeland of Israel, to defend the strong relationship America has with Israel, all of that. So, big picture is that we need, I think now more than ever, to come together and that we know we have some issues of disagreement, but what's the bigger picture, right? Is that survivalhood of the Jewish people and that we continue to thrive here in America, around the world, and in Israel.
Yeah, well, that's incredible. We're wishing you a refuah shalema. Thank you so much for the conversation. This is a lot of fun.
That was great. Thank you for having me on, and it was
Of
a phenomenal
course.
conversation.